Hey YouTubers, welcome back. Today in John's garage we have a 2000 Acura 3.2 TL and we're going to change the knock sensor. The car is 20 years old, it has 600,000 miles, the knock sensor has never been changed. So it's going to be down in here under all this in the middle of the V block where the fuel injectors are. So we're going to take off this cover, the battery cover, and we're going to dig into it until we find that knock sensor and replace it. I've gone to AutoZone and I bought a replacement already. It's SU4780 and it's Duralast, so it's lifetime guarantee, and it was $35.99. Okay, so 10 millimeter on the four corners, lefty loosey. Okay, flat screwdriver here, half turn on these two, take that right off, take that right off. So next thing we're going to do is take the ear box and snorkel off. So the ear box is just a number 2 Phillips. You can use a socket if you have the right size, or just a number 2 Phillips. It's 4 screws. Okay, this cruise control cable is just held in place like that. Get out of the way. Airbox is almost loose. Okay, that's loose. Now there's a screw right here for the throttle body intake. Number 2 Phillips. This little hose out of the way. Pull this hose out. There. Okay, there's one more hose on the back. This unplugs. And should be able to wiggle this guy out. Wait a minute. This connector here, get that out of there. It's held in right there. Okay, that's out of the way. Protect your paint on your fender. And we can leave our air cleaner element in place. We're just going to take the throttle cables off next so that we can get into here. So number 2 Phillips, 2 screws here that hold these cables. Then you pull this back and undo the end of it. So let me get those screws off. Okay, so we pulled the throttle forward and we got the 2 little ends off there. That's what they look like. Set that aside. Now we're going to take the top cover off the intake. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 millimeter nuts. Oh, actually they're bolts, so a couple of them are nuts, some are bolts. This one's a nut. I won't bore you while I'm unscrewing all 10 of those. Okay, so we got the 8 bolts and 2 nuts off. Let's take this top cover off. And this is what is known as the beehive to Acura Honda technicians. So this can get all gummed up with carbon and it needs to be cleaned if you got EGR problems. And this is a metal gasket that is reusable, and it does need to fit one way. Put this cover down. So I notice this end has to go towards the throttle body. Don't turn it this way, get it upside down, because you'll see some cutouts here and they have to match up. Don't turn it over the wrong way. It'll be apparent to you when it's the wrong way. Mechanics have done that time and time again. They've gone, well, I guess you can't go this way with it, the holes don't line up, but you could accidentally put it that way, which would be really not good. So I'll set these aside, but this is the beehive that occasionally needs cleaning. This one, the passageways, even though they're black, they're not plugged anywhere, so I've cleaned that before. There's a couple things in the back to unhook. There's a vacuum line here to unhook. There we go. So that hit the ground at least. So I'll get that off the floor. Okay, so this vacuum hose is actually the positive crankcase ventilation valve, PCV. So we'll set that aside. So we have a air intake temperature sensor to unplug here. Just squeeze the connector and pull it off. Got a vacuum line here, skinny one. Just put that up here so I don't forget to plug it back in. And we got a, looks like a brake booster vacuum line. Okay, so that's off. Okay. So now there are several bolts. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bolts and 2 nuts down inside there. They're a little bit oily, but we will take those off. So these are 12 millimeter. And they're on there pretty good. And they are torqued with a pattern, so let's get all those out. Okay, since it got a little greasy and oily, you know what really works as a good hand cleaner? Windex. Spray it on a paper towel, wipes all the grease and oil right off your hands. Little plug for Windex. Okay, so we got 2 more electrical connectors on the throttle body, throttle position sensor, and then the idle air control valve, IAC. That's the bottom one. And that has been replaced on this car probably a year or so ago. That's a little tight. Let me get a screwdriver to wedge in there. Okay, so idle air, throttle body, throttle position sensor, those are unplugged, out of the way. Got all of our nuts and bolts in there loose. And it looks like we have one more vacuum line right here to come off. Some pliers. Okay, one more vacuum line to take off here. nose is getting pretty dried out. Not so flexible anymore. That's okay. It doesn't need to move, so we'll just set that aside. And back here by the air intake temperature sensor, there's a little vacuum line right underneath it. Right there, just pulled that off. I think everything is loose now. There is a water line right here to the idle air control valve. I'm going to see if we can leave that because I really don't want to drain the coolant. I'm going to take off the 12 millimeter nuts. There's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and just remove the throttle body because it's all disconnected except for the water and the coolant. So we can take out those 4 nuts and then pull this about 2 inches to get it off of those studs and then just set it here. Then we'll be clear to remove the intake manifold. Okay, the top 2 are nuts and the bottom 2 are long bolts. So let's get those out. So we got the 2 nuts and the 2 bolts out. They're all 12 millimeter. Now we're just going to slide this forward and pull it off. There's 2 water hoses underneath it and they're not very long, so it's going to be tight. Okay, without taking off the manifold, I was able to slide it off those 2 top studs, tilting it down a little bit and pulling it off, and just set the throttle body aside. And you could clean it while you got it out, paper towel and some gum out or something, a throttle body cleaner. This one's been cleaned before, it's not too bad. You can clean the front side. Front side's pretty clean, back side is usually a little more dirty, but you can clean that while it's out of there. And you can see the 2 water lines there, 1, 2, in and out. So there is a gasket on here. It did not tear. That's good. It's a relatively new gasket. And if it tears, then that's the time to replace it. They're only like $1 or something. Okay, so we're about to lift the intake manifold off. I want to make sure I gave you the right count before. So there's, as far as bolts, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then nuts, there's 1 at each end, 2. So there's 7 bolts and 2 nuts. So we'll set those aside and then we'll lift this intake manifold by holding these 2 throttle body studs on this side and this little boss tab on the other side. It's already loose, we'll just lift it off of there. Okay, so lifted the intake manifold off, set it on the floor. It's one big piece. I don't know, probably weighs 20 pounds. And now we got the lower intake. And you want to cover these with some paper towels or cloth or something. You do not want nuts, bolts, tools falling down inside there. That would be really bad. Okay, so we plugged our lower intake manifold with 6 paper towels for safety. Okay, I think I can see the knock sensor under there, but just to orient you on this engine, the way Honda numbers their cylinders in the back is 1, 2, 3, starting with the pulleys over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it looks like between 4 and 5, right down there, the knock sensor is there. It's probably worth mentioning at this point, if you're ever going to do a valve cover gasket replacement, this is the valve cover, you have to get it torn down to this point so you can undo these bolts and take the valve cover off. Of course you have to take out your coils, but then you can take out all those bolts and lift this off. Good time to adjust your valves. Check the lash on the valves and put in a new gasket, and there's new grommets to go underneath the bolts there. I'll show you that in another video, but this is how far you have to tear down to do valve covers. Okay, so we're going to lift off the fuel rails, and they're held in with 2 8mm bolts. But before we do that, this under pressure, so these high pressure metal lines, we're going to go over here to the fuel pressure regulator, and you need a 22mm open end wrench, and we'll get on there and we're going to loosen that. And you also want to remove the gas cap, let some of the pressure off, so I'm going to do that now. It's probably also worth mentioning here that there is a gasket here, and that's reusable on this car. There's no tears in it, so that stayed on there. It's not glued or anything, it's just set on there. So that's a pretty durable gasket for the intake manifold. And since we are playing with gasoline, went ahead and disconnected the negative on the battery. I want to relearn the idle anyway. So I don't have any codes, but after doing this knock sensor, I just want to relearn the idle after we're done. Okay, so this fuel is under pressure, so I'm going to keep a rag over it. It's going to get a little messy with gas spraying, and I don't want it spraying in my eyes. So. There we go. And we're loosening the part that has the plastic cap on it. So let's just turn that one full turn at least. Might see a little bit of gasoline drip out. That's what the towels are for. So now we're going to loosen the 8mm nuts on the fuel rail cover. Let me see if I can zoom in there. There you go. There's one and there's two. Okay, so we're going to loosen those, and then we're going to pull the fuel rail straight up. So I've removed the two nuts there, 8mm, and I disconnected the fuel injectors. You just squeeze both sides and pull up. There's 3 in the front, 3 in the back. So when we pull this up, we're going to be pulling the fuel injectors out with the rail, and they have a little rubber O-ring on them, so we don't want to tear that little rubber O-ring. So if you ever need new fuel injectors for your Acura, you can get them at AutoZone. I was surprised. They're made by GP Sorensen. They're $50 each. This car, the part number is 800-1497N, and they actually came in a genuine Honda bag, and it had the OEM number on it, 06164-P8E-A00. So I have replaced all 6 fuel injectors in the last 2 years. Didn't really see anything wrong with the old ones. The O-rings kind of tore when I pulled them out, but other than that, I think the injectors are probably okay, but if I keep them as spares, I'll need to get new O-rings. Let me see if I can carefully get this out without tearing these O-rings. Okay, this gasket's a little bit in my way, so I'm going to lift it off and then plug all my holes again so nothing falls down there. Because it is a flush fit along here, so the gasket kind of overlaps that a little bit. Okay, so we're just going to wiggle this guy out of there. There we go. And there's our fuel injector O-rings. They look okay. Didn't damage them, that's good. At the top of the fuel injector, there's another piece of rubber here. You see this one got left down in there. Fish it out here. There we go. And you want to put engine oil on these, the little O-ring and the big O-ring. Put some engine oil with your finger, lubricate them so when you push it in, it doesn't bind and tear, because you don't want to tear those rubber O-rings because then you have a gas leak. Okay, I wrapped up the front fuel rail with the 3 injectors, wrapped it in a blanket like a little baby. Okay, so we need to get the plastic wire manager out of the way. And there's 2 little tabs here that you push towards the front of the car. There's one, another one over here too, next to the number 5 injector. Push those 2 tabs, and another tab right here. Separate that, and then pull up on it. And then you'll see there's 2 bolts here to get the other side of this plastic piece that has the fuel injection air system in it. So that feeds air to the manifold. So you'll see this right here, there's an air hose. So undo these 2 bolts, look like maybe 10mm, to get that plastic piece off and get this out of the way. I think that's about as far as it's going to go. Okay, so on this half of the plastic, I'm just going to leave it. Okay, so I had to make a quick trip to Lowe's to get a Craftsman 24-inch deep socket because the AutoZone didn't have any. They were out of stock. So I slipped it through here and put a swivel adapter on there. And this is 1/2 inch. This is the only thing to make the 24 in is 1/2 inch. So I got a 24-inch deep socket, 1/2 inch swivel, and then I got like a 12-inch extension, and then I got my wrench on there. And let's see, got it a little bit loose already. Put the camera down. Okay, wasn't in that tight. Get this out of here. Unfortunate. Got this out. It's my socket. And if you get yourself one of these magnets in the auto parts store, you could fish that guy out of there. There we go. That's the old sensor. It's not corroded. It's not broken. Might be good, I don't know. But we got the new one. So the original was kind of a dark beige, and AutoZone, same single pin, same connector, it's just gray. The length and everything's the same, so look like we're going to be okay. Okay, so we can see down in there, that's where the new one's going to mount. And then there's the connector that I used needle nose, long needle nose to pull off. And there you go. This shows it pretty good. So I'll thread this in by hand a little bit and then tighten it up. Use my long needle nose to put the connector back on. Okay, I'm going to try a little trick. So this is the old part, and I got a just a 5/8 shallow socket. I'm just going to put it on the plastic part, and this is a 6-point. So if I can put maybe some tape or make it stick on there a little bit, then I can get a socket that's smaller and more maneuverable, so I can thread this in, get the thread started just by hand with an extension swivel, because I don't want to use a wrench to torque this thing. So I'll get it started in there because I can't get my fingers down to turn this thing, and the needle nose, it's hard to maneuver. So I'm going to try this gadget. Okay, this little setup here worked great. Just I'll show you with the old part again. Just on the plastic, so we're not going to put any torque on it. And I used some needle nose to get it down there and just setting on top, and then I put this down in there, got it on top of there, and then I just by hand just turned it all the way until it was just about tight. And now I'm going to get the correct size 24mm socket so I can get on the steel part of this, or whatever it is, and I'll torque it down. That worked out great. Okay, so there's the new knock sensor from AutoZone. The top is gray, so that's tight. I couldn't find a torque spec in the book, but with that swivel you're only going to get it so tight. It wasn't in there super tight to begin with from the factory. I would guess maybe 30 foot-pounds. Okay, I got the connector back on. It's the connector with the single wire, and just had to spin it around because the clip is now facing the front instead of the back. But using these long needle nose that are typical of Honda for getting the coil boots out of the deep well for a spark plug when they come off. These were really helpful to go down in there and place that connector on. So I was wondering where the other end of that wire goes from that connector. It's a single red wire, and it comes over here behind the power steering pump. So this connector right here with the yellow paint on it, and then it comes out the top with this yellow mark on it, the light's there, and then it goes down, joined with another wire, I guess, that then it goes to the ECU somehow. I don't know the path, but this is the nearest connector. So if a rat chewed your wire, then you'd undo this connector. And the wire is only a couple of inches long. I'd say 6 inches long, single red wire with a little insulating tube around it. So connector at both ends. Okay, so we're going to start reassembling by putting in these 2 bolts in the plastic fuel rail. The plastic fuel rail is going to go back down here if we get this thing bolted in. Really didn't need to take these 2 bolts out, so I mean, maybe it gave me a tiny bit of space right here to get the big 24mm socket to go through. It might have given me just enough room, but you can try not removing it. These are 10mm. This is plastic. Just holding plastic down so I don't get carried away with the torque. So on these fuel injector tips, let's get a little bit of clean motor oil and lubricate the rubber. We don't want to tear these things because they're going to be going into that aluminum lower intake manifold, and I don't want to bind on anything that's going to tear it. Okay, so I'm just going to line this up real carefully. All 3 injectors lined up in there. When you get the tip in there, you'll know, and then you just got the outer big ring to go. There. That has seated down there perfectly. Now we'll get the 2 8mm bolts. So carefully thread those in by hand. This is threading into aluminum. Make sure they're straight. You don't want to cross thread it. You only got 2 little bolts to hold that fuel rail in place. Don't over torque it. It's just to hold the fuel rail in place. It's maybe, I don't know, 16 foot-pounds, something like that. Now let's put the plastic wire manager back in place where it belongs. There's really just these 2 connectors here that really snap into place. And if you can't lift up on it, then it's in. Plug in fuel injector 4, 5, and 6. Let's see. 6 didn't go in so well. Let's get a good snap. There. Make sure they're not loose. Okay, 4, 5, and 6 are plugged in, and let's put this, take those paper towels out. I'm going to clean this off and put that back in. Okay, so let's pull these paper plugs out and line this back up on there. Let's see, looks like it goes this way, that screw and that screw. I notice this is 3 pieces of metal making that gasket. Not just 1, it's 3. So we got our holes lined up. So put my plugs back in here temporarily. Okay, so we'll put our gas cap back on, and now we're going to tighten the fuel pressure regulator. We only loosened it 1 turn, so it's right here. It was 1 full turn, 22mm. Wrench on there. Okay, that appears to be tight. Okay, what I like to do now, before I reassemble the rest of the engine, is I like to check for leaks in these fuel injectors and the fuel pressure regulator. So I'm going to go in the car and turn the key on, not start the car, but turn it on so you hear the fuel pump. And this is under tremendous pressure, so if there's a leak, it's going to go squirting, you're going to smell gas. Make sure the garage is ventilated. So, took the negative off, so let's put the negative back on. I'm not going to tighten it yet. Okay, you probably heard the fuel pump prime, and we're looking for leaks, and I don't see any. Under the fuel pressure regulator, let me dry it off because it was dripping a tiny bit when it was open. So I don't see any leaks, I don't smell any leaks. I think we're good now. Okay, I got the key off. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect the negative on the battery. We did not tighten it, so I'm just going to pull it off while we put everything back on the engine, put all the connectors back. So now we're going to put the intake manifold back on. Now we'll put the 2 nuts and 7 bolts in there. Okay, so the Acura shop manual says the torque spec on these is 16 foot-pounds. Doesn't sound like much, but let's go in a crisscross pattern, skipping end to end, working to the middle. Right now they're just really loose and not tight at all. So. Anyway, I will get those in. I won't bore you with it. Okay, now we put the beehive back on, paying attention to this gasket orientation. There, that square there, right there is just a big opening, but it lines up here. You got the EGR ports, little tiny holes here. There's 1, 2, there's 3 on each side, little EGR ports. I guess 1 for each cylinder. I got the beehive, goes on the top. And these nuts and bolts, the manual says only 9 foot-pounds. Okay, so we got the beehive torqued down, all the bolts. Nuts and bolts to 9 foot-pounds or a little more. Okay, let's plug in our intake air temperature sensor. And underneath that is a little vacuum, and we got another vacuum here, and then we got a brake booster vacuum. I'm gonna need some pliers for that. There we go. And we need our positive crankcase ventilation. This PCV valve has a little rattle you can hear. When you test it, you plug it and see if you get a little noise in there. This has been replaced, so it's good. So I'll get over here with these pliers. So now we're going to put the throttle body back on. It's still connected to the water hoses, and we got our gasket on here that's still good. So, not to damage those threads. Lift it up as much as I can to go straight. There we go. 2 nuts, 2 bolts. There are 2 nuts, 2 bolts. It's easier to put the 2 nuts on the top first. We're not going to tighten it yet. So I'm going to get these in next. I won't bore. Okay, we got the 2 nuts, 2 bolts torqued down. And now we got a bunch of hoses and such, connectors to put on. Let's put a few of those on now. Here's our throttle position sensor. Here's our idle air control valve. And I'm not going to plug that one in yet. I'm going to get the air box and snorkel on there next. Okay, so now we got 2 hoses. There's one on the front, and another one right behind it in the back here. And then we got an electrical connector. Put it through the wire manager here. And plug that baby in until it clicks. Okay, so now we got another hose here in the front. That's the one the rubber's getting very hard. This little hose manager here and the snorkel. Fit that in there. And then move that hose clamp on there. Now we got to put our throttle, so we got our cruise control, and we got our foot pedal, and just turn the spring up, loop these in and push them in. I'll do that off camera so I won't bore you. Okay, so now we got to put these 2 number 2 Phillips screws in the bracket that holds the gas pedal linkage. We'll get a number 2 screwdriver and do that. Well, it looks like I should have put those 2 screws in before the snorkel, so I'm going to remove the snorkel and air cleaner lid real quick, put those 2 screws in and put the snorkel back on. Okay, the 2 screws for the throttle bracket are in. Let me tighten down the snorkel I just put back on. Just 1 screw here. A large hose clamp on that snorkel. And put this back in its little hose manager. That's on. There's a hose in the back I got to put back on. There we go. Put the electrical, route the electrical properly so it doesn't get pinched anywhere. There we go. Okay, I'll put the air box back on, make sure the filter is lined up. So it got moved around a little bit. Make sure the holes line up in that filter. Get the air box back on. Make sure it's all the way down before we start screwing it with a screwdriver. So now I'm going to connect the negative on the battery. And I should have told you, before you disconnect the battery, make sure you got your navigation code and your radio code numbers. You should have them written in your owner's manual or somewhere in your glove box. So you'll need to reset those when you put the battery back on. Your clock is going to be at 00 in the navigation if you have Navi. And your radio won't work until you punch in the code. And then you got to do all your presets for your radio stations for AM and FM. Now we put our fancy cover back on our battery. Now we're going to put on our other beauty covers here. We have this one in the front, and that just goes on a half a turn straight up and down and half a turn to the right. Same over here, straight up and down. Oop. Half a turn to the right. We got the big cover. Let's tuck it under there. Forward a little bit. There we go. Hand thread those in a little bit. Make sure they're going in straight. 10 millimeter. Only needs like 5 pounds of force. It doesn't take much. Just a plastic cover. Okay, so now we're going to start up the car and do the idle relearn. So once it's started, everything's turned off, the air conditioning, fans, everything's turned off. Bring it up to 3,000 RPMs and hold it at 3,000 RPMs for several minutes until both radiator fans turn on. And then lay your foot off the gas and let it just idle at the usual 750 RPMs for 5 minutes. And then turn the car off and it's relearned the idle. We're going to do that now. Okay, so we've done the idle relearn. The engine's running really smooth. I think we can call that job done.